Welcome to the deep dive. I want to start today by asking you to just visualize something for a second. Picture a vast, sprawling landscape.
Just completely wide open.
Yeah, exactly. And dotted all across this landscape, as far as you can see, there are these individual oil wells, thousands of them, maybe even millions.
All just pumping away.
Right. Every single day, these wells are bringing crude oil up to the surface. And we all know crude oil has incredible potential. I mean, it literally changed the world.
But not in its raw state.
Exactly. Right out of the ground, it's thick, it's messy, it's chaotic. It is largely unusable. You could not take a bucket of that raw crude oil, walk over to a high-performance sports car, and just pour it directly into the fuel tank.
No, the engine would completely choke. It would seize up and be destroyed.
Which is exactly where we're going today.
Because that analogy really does capture the current state of medical science perfectly.
Yeah.
In the world of global healthcare, that high-performance engine is clinical practice. It's public health policy.
It's the decision a doctor is making when you are sitting right there in front of them.
Precisely. And those millions of individual oil wells scattered across the landscape, those represent the single isolated medical studies being published all over the world every single day.
Just a constant flow of raw data.
Right. And if we just dump the raw findings of every single new trial or, every new observational cohort directly into the engine of healthcare policy without processing it first, the system breaks down.
You end up with contradictory guidelines.
Contradictory guidelines, confused doctors, and ultimately absolute chaos in patient care.
Which is exactly why we are not spending our time looking at the individual oil wells today. We are taking a step back to look at the architecture of the refinery.
The industrial process itself.
Yes. We are going to explore the massive, rigorous, highly disciplined processes that take all of those chaotic individual data points and distill them down into the high-octane fuel of synthesized certainty.
I love that framing.
So our mission for this deep dive is to guide you through Chapter 5.15 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health. We want to build a conceptual framework for you.
We want to show you the actual mechanics of how public health professionals separate the true signal from the overwhelming noise.
Right, relying on structured, disciplined aggregation rather than just, the individual brilliance of a single scientist.
And this challenge of signal versus noise is not a new phenomenon at all, even though the internet makes it feel like one.
Oh, for sure. We feel so overwhelmed by data right now.
But to give you some historical perspective on this, we can look back to a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. This was in 1884.
Wow, 1884.
Right. Lord Rayleigh, who was a very prominent professor of physics at Cambridge University, stood up and made a rather profound observation. He said, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, if science consisted in nothing but the laborious accumulation of facts, it would soon come to a standstill, crushed under its own weight.
Crushed under its own weight. That is incredibly prescient.
He understood, well over a century ago, that merely collecting facts is insufficient. You have to digest them. You must assimilate the old material with the exact same rigor that you apply to generating new material.
I can only imagine what Lord Rayleigh would think if he saw the state of academic publishing today.
He would be horrified.
Truly. The Oxford textbook points out that by the mid-1990s, there were already over 20,000 biomedical journals in existence.
Pumping out around 2 million articles every single year.
2 million. And with the rise of digital open access publishing, that number has just skyrocketed. It is a physical impossibility for any practicing clinician or health minister or any medical student listening to this right now to read all of that.
You cannot keep up with the daily output of the wells.
Therefore, any new research or any new clinical guideline has to begin and end with an understanding of the totality of the available evidence. We are completely dependent on the refinery.
And that reality necessitates a major conceptual shift in how we view evidence. We have to draw a very sharp, very distinct line between what we call a traditional literature review and a systematic review.
Okay, let's get into this. Because for a long time, the medical community treated them as roughly the same thing, right?
Yes, which was a catastrophic error.
Help me understand the difference, because on the surface, a review is just a review. Someone reads a bunch of papers and writes a summary.
And that is exactly the trap. If a systematic review is our heavily engineered industrial refinery, the traditional literature review is more like a casual Sunday afternoon stroll through a botanical garden.
A botanical garden?
Think about it. The author of a traditional review, who is often an esteemed expert in their field, walks through the literature. They see a study over here that they like, so they pick it.
Like picking a flower.
Exactly. They see another study over there that supports their existing theories, so they pick that one too. Maybe they ignore the studies hidden in the thorny bushes because they contradict their life's work.
Right, they just walk right past those.
They gather up all their favorite flowers, tie them together with a nice narrative ribbon, and present it as a comprehensive bouquet of knowledge.
But because there are no rules about which flowers they have to pick, it's incredibly vulnerable to their personal biases. I mean, they are essentially just writing an opinion piece with footnotes.
Precisely. And the medical community was largely blind to how dangerous this was until the late 1980s. A brilliant researcher named Cynthia Mulrow published a seminal paper in 1987.
What does she do?
She systematically analyzed 50 review articles that had been published in leading, highly respected medical journals between 1985 and 1986. Her findings were a massive wake-up call to the scientific establishment.
What did she find?
She demonstrated that these traditional reviews routinely failed to use any recognizable, reproducible scientific methods to identify, assess, or synthesize the research. They were just narrative summaries masking massive subjective bias.
But wait, did this actually hurt anyone? I mean, sure, it's lazy science, but were patients actually suffering because some professor wrote a biased review article?
Absolutely. The failure to systematically refine evidence had massive, devastating real-world consequences, measured in human lives.
Really? How so?
To illustrate this, the Oxford text directs us to a landmark 1992 study by Antman and colleagues. This team looked specifically at the history of treatments for myocardial infarction, heart attacks.
Okay.
They decided to compare two things. On one side, they looked at the timeline of when the accumulated pooled data from randomized controlled trials actually proved that a treatment worked. On the other side, they looked at the clinical recommendations being published in textbooks and traditional review articles by the leading experts of the day.
So they wanted to see the gap between when the data proved a drug worked and when the experts actually told doctors to start using it.
Exactly, and the gap was horrifying. Let's look at thrombolytic therapy clot-busting drugs.
Right.
The cumulative randomized trial data proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that clot-busting drugs saved the lives of heart attack patients by the early to mid-1980s. The statistical certainty was overwhelming.
But the experts weren't recommending it.
No. Because the experts were writing traditional narrative reviews, often relying on outdated personal experience or smaller, flawed studies, they failed to recommend thrombolytic therapy as standard care for years. Sometimes it took over a decade for the expert consensus to catch up to the statistical reality.
A decade.
Yes.
In the context of heart attacks, a 10-year delay in rolling out a life-saving drug means thousands upon thousands of people died unnecessarily simply because their doctors were following the advice of a flawed traditional literature review.
And the Antman study found the inverse was also true. While the traditional reviews were delaying life-saving treatments, they were simultaneously recommending ineffective or actively harmful interventions long after the rigorous trials had proven them dangerous.
Give me an example of that.
Prophylactic antiarrhythmic drugs are a tragic example. Routine use actually increased mortality in some heart attack patients, but expert reviews continued to recommend them simply because the authors hadn't systematically evaluated the totality of the evidence.
That is just, wow.
People suffered, and massive amounts of healthcare resources were wasted, simply because we trusted the individual brilliance of experts instead of disciplined aggregation.
That is incredibly sobering. It really hammers home why we can't just rely on someone's opinion no matter how many letters they have after their name.
Exactly.
So we need to clearly define the alternative. Chapter 5.15 provides a breakdown in Table 5.15.1, differentiating a systematic review from a traditional review. Walk me through the actual mechanics of how a systematic review operates differently, step by step.
It comes down to 5 core pillars. First is the question. A traditional review usually tackles a broad, vague topic, something like the management of heart disease.
Very broad.
A systematic review, however, must be built around a highly focused, specific question. It is narrow and sharp.
We will definitely get into how they formulate that question in a minute. What's the second pillar?
The search strategy. In a traditional review, the author uses convenient sampling. They search their own filing cabinets, or they run a quick database search and grab the first 20 papers that look interesting.
Just whatever is easiest to find.
Right. A systematic review demands an exhaustive, comprehensive search. The goal is to locate absolutely all relevant studies worldwide, regardless of whether they are easy to find, to prevent what we call publication bias.
And the third pillar is eligibility. I imagine this is how you stop the reviewer from just cherry-picking the data they like.
Yes, traditional reviews rarely specify why some studies were included and others were ignored. It is an opaque process.
You just have to trust them.
Exactly. Systematic reviews mandate explicit, transparent, predefined eligibility criteria. You state exactly what the rules of entry are before you even look at the papers. If a study doesn't meet the criteria, it is excluded, and you have to state exactly why it was excluded.
That transparency is huge. So the fourth pillar involves appraising the evidence. I've noticed in traditional reviews, the author often just quotes the findings of a study as if it's the absolute truth, without questioning how the study was conducted.
That is a major flaw. Not all science is created equal. A systematic review systematically appraises the methodology of every single included study to determine its risk of bias. It is a formal interrogation of the evidence.
And finally, the fifth pillar.
Synthesis. Traditional reviews just give you a qualitative narrative summary. A systematic review, whenever the data allows it, utilizes statistical pooling, known as meta-analysis, to mathematically combine the data. This provides a quantified, rigorous measure of the overall treatment effect and the margin of uncertainty.
So when you stack all of this together, where does the systematic review sit in the grand scheme of medical research? If I'm looking at a single randomized trial versus a systematic review, which one carries more weight?
This is where we introduce the concept of the hierarchy of evidence. Picture a large pyramid.
Okay, I've got it.
The base of the pyramid is very wide, and this represents expert opinion, editorials, and mechanistic reasoning based on basic science. It is foundational, but it is highly vulnerable to bias and subjective error.
So the lowest level of trust.
Right. As you move up the pyramid, the rigor increases and the risk of bias decreases. Above expert opinion, you have your observational studies, case control studies, and cohort studies.
Okay.
Moving higher, near the peak, you find randomized controlled trials, which most people consider the gold standard for primary experiments.
But they aren't the absolute peak, are they?
No, they are not.
Ah.
Sitting at the very pinnacle of the evidence pyramid, looking down over everything else, is the systematic review and meta-analysis.
Because it takes all of those individual randomized trials sitting beneath it, filters out their individual biases, and synthesizes them.
Exactly. Into the most reliable, mathematically robust form of evidence that humanity can currently produce. This hierarchy is so widely accepted now that major funding bodies will often refuse to grant money for a new clinical trial unless the researchers have first conducted a systematic review.
Wow, really?
Yes. They need to prove they understand the existing landscape.
Yeah.
You must know what the architecture of the current evidence looks like before you ask for millions of dollars to build an addition.
That makes perfect sense. You wouldn't pour a new foundation without checking the blueprints of the house first. So let's talk about those blueprints. If I am a researcher and I want to build a systematic review, where do I actually start? I assume I don't just log into a database and start downloading PDFs.
Absolutely not. The most crucial step of the entire process happens before you read a single paper. You have to write the protocol.
The protocol.
In public health methodology, a systematic review is treated as a major scientific investigation in its own right, which means it requires a pre-flight checklist. The protocol is a detailed, formal document that outlines the objectives of the review and the exact proposed methods you intend to use.
Why is the protocol so rigid? If you are a smart scientist, shouldn't you be allowed to adapt your methods if you find something unexpected halfway through your research?
In a primary exploratory study, perhaps, but in evidence synthesis, adapting on the fly is a recipe for disaster. It comes down to the mechanism of bias prevention.
How so?
Human beings are inherently pattern-seeking creatures. We want to find a story in the data. Imagine you're conducting a review on a new diet pill. You start extracting the data, and you notice a slight trend suggesting the pill works really well in women under 40, but not so well in older men.
So I might be tempted to change my research question to focus just on the younger women because that's where the exciting data is.
Exactly. You might consciously or subconsciously alter your inclusion criteria or tweak your statistical methods to highlight that specific trend. This is called post hoc decision-making, and it introduces massive bias.
You're drawing the bullseye around where the arrow already landed?
That's a great way to put it. The protocol locks you in. It forces you to define your methods before you know what the data looks like.
Oh.
And to enforce this transparency, reviewers are strongly encouraged to publicly register their protocols in international databases.
Like which ones?
The Oxford text highlights Prospero, which is an international prospective register of systematic reviews maintained by the University of York, as well as the Cochrane database.
So it's essentially a public declaration. You are telling the world, here are the rules I'm going to follow, and you can hold me to them. Plus, I'd imagine checking Prospero prevents two different teams of researchers, say one in Toronto and one in Tokyo, from accidentally spending 2 years doing the exact same systematic review.
Precisely. It prevents massive duplication of effort and resource waste. Now, the very first thing you define in that public protocol is the question you are trying to answer. And as we mentioned earlier, the question must be razor sharp.
Right, no broad botanical garden strolls.
In clinical and public health reviews, particularly those evaluating an intervention, we use a structural framework known as PICO. P-I-C-O.
PICO. Let me guess how this works. I assume it's an acronym to help structure the search criteria. If I want to know if giving people free nicotine patches helps them quit smoking better than just giving them a pamphlet, my PKK would be, let me think. P stands for participants. So my participants are adult smokers.
Good.
I is intervention. That's the free nicotine patch. C is control.
Close. C stands for comparator. It serves the same function, but comparator is a more accurate term because you aren't always comparing an intervention to a placebo control. Sometimes you are comparing it to the current standard of care.
Ah, okay. So the comparator is the informational pamphlet, and O is outcome. So the outcome is whether they successfully quit smoking after 6 months.
You've got it. Participants, intervention, comparator, outcome. PICO transforms a vague curiosity into a highly structured, scientifically testable query.
Can you give us an example from the text?
The textbook provides a great example regarding tuberculosis. A poor question would be, what is the best way to ensure TB patients take their medication? A rigorous PICO question asks in patients receiving treatment for clinical tuberculosis, does a policy of direct observation of treatment versus a policy of self-treatment lead to different treatment success rates?
That is incredibly tight. Once you have that PICO structure, your database search strategy practically writes itself because you know the exact keywords you need. But wait, can you only use PTO for medical treatments? What if I'm an epidemiologist trying to figure out if a certain chemical causes cancer? There's no intervention there, unless you're a supervillain secretly exposing people to chemicals.
That is a great distinction. When we shift from questions of treatment to questions of etiology, meaning the cause of a disease, or questions of risk, we adapt the framework slightly to PICO. P-E-C-O.
PICO.
The I for intervention becomes an E for exposure.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if we look at an example from maternal health, are women who smoke during pregnancy, that covers the participants, pregnant women, and the exposure, smoking.
Yes.
Compared to non-smokers, there's the comparator. Are they more likely to give birth to children who develop asthma in the first 5 years of life? And that is the outcome.
Exactly. Whether it is PICO or PICO, the framework dictates the architecture of the entire review. Yeah. But there is a massive strategic dilemma that the systematic reviewer faces right at this stage. They have to decide how broad or how narrow to make their PICO question. And this is a fundamental tension in public health synthesis.
Walk me through that tension. Why wouldn't you just make it as broad as possible so you can gather all the available information?
Because of the apples and oranges problem. Let's say you want to write a review on interventions to improve medication adherence in chronic disease. That is an incredibly broad scope. Sure. You are going to be pulling in studies involving elderly patients with heart failure using daily pill organizers, mixed with studies of teenagers with asthma using text message reminders, mixed with studies of psychiatric patients receiving weekly injections.
Right, those are vastly different populations dealing with vastly different physical and psychological barriers. If you try to mathematically combine the data from the teenager with asthma and the senior with heart failure, the resulting average might be completely meaningless.
We call that clinical and statistical heterogeneity. When you go too broad, the noise overwhelms the signal again.
But on the flip side, what if you make it too narrow?
If you make your PICO incredibly narrow, for example, text message reminders for 14-year-old boys with severe allergic asthma in urban centers, you might run a massive global database search and find exactly 0 studies that meet your criteria. You will have an empty review.
So the reviewer has to walk a tightrope. They need a question broad enough to capture enough data to reach statistical power, but narrow enough that the patients and interventions are actually comparable in the real world.
Which leads us directly into the next phase of the refinery process, the scavenger hunt.
The scavenger hunt.
This is where the theoretical PICO framework is translated into strict, uncompromising eligibility criteria for the review. How do we decide which studies make it through the front door and which ones are turned away?
Let's look at a concrete example from the textbook. Box 5.15.1 details the eligibility criteria for a Cochrane review on adenoidectomy for children with a condition called otitis media, which is a chronic middle ear infection with fluid buildup. How did they set the rules?
They took their PCO question and built a fortress around it. For the participants' criteria, they were absolutely strict. Entry was restricted exclusively to children under the age of 18 who had a confirmed clinical diagnosis of otitis media with effusion.
So if a study included 19-year-olds,
Thrown out. If a study looked at children with acute ear infections rather than chronic effusion, it was thrown out.
and for the intervention and comparator,
They only accepted studies that compared a specific surgery and adenoidectomy against non-surgical management, which could include watchful waiting or basic medical treatment. If a researcher published a brilliant study comparing an adenoidectomy to a tonsillectomy, it was immediately excluded because the comparator didn't match the protocol.
they also added a very specific rule for the outcome. The primary measure had to be the proportion of time the child spent with fluid in their ear over a defined period.
Yes, but the most critical rule they added was an S to the end of PCO.
Pisces.
The S. What does that stand for? Study design. They drew a hard line in the sand and stated they would only include randomized controlled trials. Every single observational study, no matter how large or well-funded, was banned from the review.
Banned. And we really need to pause here and understand why systematic reviewers are so obsessed with study design eligibility. Why would you throw away data from a massive observational study that tracks 10,000 patients?
To understand the reasoning, we have to look at one of the most fascinating and consequential paradigm shifts in modern global public health history. It involves the relationship between male circumcision and the prevention of HIV acquisition in heterosexual men.
This is a wild story. Set the scene for us. What did the evidence landscape look like in the mid-1990s?
In 1995, the HIV pandemic was raging, and public health officials were desperate for preventive interventions. There was a theory circulating that male circumcision might reduce the risk of acquiring the virus. So, a systematic review was commissioned to look at the evidence.
But there were no randomized trials yet, right?
Correct. Because there were no randomized trials at the time, the reviewers cast a wide net and gathered 37 different observational studies from various countries.
And when they laid all 37 of those observational studies out on the table, what did the data actually say?
It was absolute chaos. When they plotted the results, the data points were scattered everywhere. Some studies suggested that circumcision offered a massive protective effect. Other studies showed absolutely zero effect.
And some studies even hinted that circumcision might increase the risk of getting HIV. The statistical heterogeneity, the disagreement between the studies was astronomical.
Exactly.
Why was the data so messy? Were the scientists just bad at measuring things?
No, the scientists were competent, but they were victims of residual confounding, which is the fatal flaw of observational epidemiology.
Residual confounding.
In an observational study, the researchers don't assign the intervention. The men in those 37 studies weren't randomly assigned to be circumcised or uncircumcised. They were already circumcised based on their cultural background, their religious beliefs, or their personal choices.
And a man's cultural or religious background probably influences a whole host of other behaviors.
Precisely. The two groups of men, circumcised and uncircumcised, likely had vastly different sexual behaviors, different numbers of partners, different rates of condom use, and lived in different social contexts with varying background rates of HIV prevalence.
No, it's completely tangled.
The researchers tried to adjust for these confounding variables mathematically, but you can never capture all of them. The unmeasured differences, the residual confounding, created so much noise that it drowned out the true biological effect of the circumcision itself.
So what did the reviewers do in 1995? Did they just average all the messy data together and guess?
To their immense credit, no. They recognized that garbage in equals garbage out. They concluded that the observational evidence was simply too flawed, too confounded to guide global health policy. They stated that the world needed to wait for randomized controlled trials to strip away the confounding variables.
And that wait took over a decade. Let's fast forward to 2009. The Cochrane collaboration publishes a brand new, updated systematic review on circumcision and HIV. But this time, the eligibility rules have changed.
Drastically changed. In the 2009 review, they completely threw out all the messy observational data. They restricted their study design eligibility exclusively to 3 massive, newly completed randomized controlled trials conducted in South Africa, Uganda, and Kenya.
And because these were randomized trials, the researchers actually took thousands of adult men who volunteered for the study and flipped a coin. Heads, you get circumcised now. Tails, you wait 2 years for the procedure.
Exactly. By using the mechanism of random allocation, they ensured that the men in the intervention group and the men in the control group were, on average, identical in every way. They had the same baseline risk behaviors, the same cultural backgrounds, the same age distributions.
The only difference between the two groups was the surgery.
They successfully stripped away the residual confounding.
So what happened to all that deafening noise in the data?
It vanished completely. When they synthesized the data from those 3 randomized trials, the signal came through with crystalline, undeniable clarity.
Oh.
All 3 trials showed a highly consistent, statistically robust reduction in HIV acquisition among the circumcised men.
Wow.
In fact, the effect was so strong, showing a 38% to 66% reduction in risk, that the independent safety monitoring boards halted all 3 trials early because it was deemed unethical to withhold the surgery from the control groups any longer.
That is incredible. The exact same public health question. But because they restricted the eligibility criteria to the gold standard of study design, they went from absolute confusion to a globally recognized, life-saving intervention strategy endorsed by the WHO.
It perfectly illustrates why the refinery's filters must be so strict. It is the ultimate proof that in evidence synthesis, quality is infinitely more important than quantity.
But even if you have perfect eligibility criteria mapped out, you still face a monumental logistical challenge. You have to actually find the studies.
Right, the actual hunt.
And the textbook makes it very clear that you cannot just type your PyCO question into Google Scholar, download the first page of results, and call it a systematic review. You have to cast a global dragnet.
The required search strategy is exhausting, but it is absolutely necessary. You have to scour the major bibliographic databases. Medline and Embase are the heavyweights. They cover the vast majority of prominent North American and European biomedical journals.
But stopping there is a critical error.
Because the world is bigger than North America and Europe.
Precisely. You must search Central, which is the Cochrane Central Register of Controlled Trials. You have to search LILS.
What is ILAS? I don't think I've heard of that one.
Oh, right. ILACS is the paramount index for scientific and health literature from Latin America and the Caribbean. If you are conducting a review on a tropical disease or a specific maternal health intervention and you ignore ILACS, you are systematically erasing the scientific contributions and the clinical realities of an entire continent.
That's a huge blind spot.
Exactly. You also have to search regional databases like the African Healthline and subject-specific databases like PsychMLFO if your intervention has any behavioral or psychological components.
Why go to all this trouble? Why learn to navigate 5 different database interfaces just to find a handful of extra papers? Are we really that worried about missing one tiny trial in Brazil?
We are terrified of missing it.
Terrified.
Terrified because of 2 insidious, structurally embedded threats in academic publication bias and reporting bias.
All right.
Let's examine the incentive structures of the scientific world. Imagine a team of researchers at a prestigious university conducts a trial testing a new, expensive drug for diabetes. At the end of the trial, the data shows the drug works brilliantly. Patients lose weight, blood sugar plummets. This is a positive study.
Everyone is happy. The researchers are going to write that up immediately and submit it to the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet. It's exciting, groundbreaking news.
Major, high-impact English language journals love publishing positive, statistically significant results. But now, imagine the alternate scenario. The same team runs the trial, but the drug is a total flop.
A total flop.
Doesn't lower blood sugar at all, and it makes the patients incredibly nauseous. This is a negative or null result.
I imagine the researchers are pretty depressed. The pharmaceutical company that funded it is definitely not happy.
And human nature takes over. The researchers might lose enthusiasm. They might get busy with a new project and just never bother going through the agonizing process of writing up the manuscript.
Or if they do write it up, they send it to a major journal, and the editor rejects it because a drug feeling isn't novel or exciting enough to generate citations.
Exactly. So what happens to the data? Does it just disappear?
It often sinks into the gray literature. It might get published in a small, obscure, non-English regional journal. It might only ever exist as a poster presentation abstract at a niche medical conference. Or it might just sit in a filing cabinet in the investigator's office forever.
And here's where the math gets terrifying. If I'm writing a systematic review on that diabetes drug and I only search Medline for English language journals, I am only going to find the positive studies. The negative studies are invisible to me.
Which means you are essentially stacking the deck. You will extract the data from the positive studies, pool them together, and conclude that the drug is an absolute miracle.
Your systematic review will mathematically generate an over-optimistic, completely distorted illusion of reality. You have synthesized a lie.
That is horrifying. The systematic review is supposed to be the pinnacle of truth, but if the search strategy is weak, it just amplifies the publication bias.
This is why high sensitivity in your search strategy is non-negotiable. You have to hunt down the unpublished data, the conference abstracts, the foreign language regional journals. You even have to look at clinical trial registries to find trials that were registered years ago but mysteriously never published their results. And then you have to email the authors and beg them for the hidden data.
Wow. Okay, let's assume we've done the grueling work. We ran the global dragnet. We translated the Chinese and Spanish abstracts. We emailed the lazy authors. We now have a stack of 40 eligible randomized controlled trials sitting on our desk. Now we enter the next major phase of the refinery extraction and interrogation.
The extraction phase is where we physically pull the necessary data, the participant numbers, the outcomes, the standard deviations, out of the PDFs and into our statistical software. And because humans are fallible, the textbook strictly advises that data extraction must be performed by at least 2 independent reviewers.
So reviewer A reads the paper and types the numbers into a spreadsheet. Reviewer B reads the exact same paper and types the numbers into their own spreadsheet. Then they compare.
Correct. If reviewer A accidentally transposed a digit, typing a 9 instead of a 6, reviewer B's spreadsheet will flag the discrepancy. They sit down, look at the original paper together, and resolve the error. If they can't agree, a third senior reviewer arbitrates. It is quality control at the most granular level.
But during this data extraction, the reviewers also have to act like forensic accountants, right? Because there is a very dark corner of medical publishing that they have to navigate. Walk us through the nightmare of covert duplicate publication.
It is a deeply frustrating reality in evidence synthesis. Sometimes a research team will conduct a single clinical trial with 500 patients. They will take the results of that trial and publish it in Journal X. Then, a year later, they will take the exact same data set from the exact same 500 patients, tweak the title of the paper slightly, maybe shuffle the order of the authors' names, and submit it to Journal Y as if it is a brand new study.
Wait, they just republished the same data to pad their resumes.
Sadly, yes. It is an unethical practice, but it happens. Now, imagine you are the systematic reviewer. You find the paper in Journal X, and you extract the data for those 500 patients. A few days later, you find the paper in Journal Y. It looks like a different study, so you extract the data for those 500 patients too.
Oh, no. You've just double counted the exact same human beings. It's like letting the same person vote twice in an election.
Precisely. You have artificially doubled the sample size of that specific trial in your meta-analysis, which drastically inflates its statistical weight. If that double-counted trial happened to have an unusually positive result, you have just severely biased the entire aggregate outcome of your review.
How on earth do you catch that?
Reviewers have to be incredibly sharp detectives. They look for suspicious similarities. Are the baseline demographics of the patients in the 2 papers exactly identical down to the decimal point? Are the hospitals and dates of the trial the same? If it looks like a clone, the reviewer has to investigate, and if confirmed, they merge the papers and only count the patients once.
So once the data is cleanly extracted and the clones are eliminated, we reach what I think is the most intellectually demanding part of the whole process: assessing the risk of bias for every single included study. Because again, just because a study says it's a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean the researchers actually did a good job.
A label is not a guarantee of quality. You cannot assume a trial is flawless. You have to rigorously interrogate its methodology.
And the textbook points us to the gold standard framework for this interrogation, the Cochrane domain-based scheme, outlined in Table 5.15.2. It breaks down the concept of bias into 5 specific domains, identifying exactly how human error or manipulation corrupts scientific data.
I think the best way to understand these abstract domains is to build a hypothetical scenario. Let's invent a fake clinical trial. We are testing a brand new, revolutionary, highly expensive drug for severe migraines. We'll call it MigraClear.
MigraClear.
Catchy.
The trial compares MigraClear against a placebo sugar pill. Let's walk through the 5 domains and see how a poorly run trial could be ruined by bias at every step.
I like this approach. The first domain we assess is selection bias. The core question here is, were the baseline characteristics of the two groups systematically different before the intervention even started? To prevent this, a trial must use true sequence generation, like a computer random number generator, to assign patients to the drug or placebo group.
But just generating the random sequence isn't enough, right? The textbook talks about allocation concealment. What is that, and how does failing to do it ruin our migraclear trial? Allocation concealment is the mechanism that hides the random sequence from the doctors enrolling the patients. Historically, researchers used to put the assignments in envelopes, but doctors, wanting their sickest patients to get the new wonder drug, would literally hold the envelopes up to a bright light to see if the slip inside said migraclear or placebo.
So if a doctor saw that the next envelope contained the placebo, they might tell their patient with the agonizing daily migraines to come back tomorrow and give the placebo envelope to a patient with only mild headaches.
Exactly. By subverting the random sequence, the doctors subconsciously pack the migraclear group with the severe cases and the placebo group with the mild cases. They have systematically unbalanced the baseline characteristics. The systematic reviewer looks for proof of strict, tamper-proof allocation concealment, like a centralized, automated telephone randomization system. If it's missing, the study is flagged for high risk of selection bias.
Okay, so the patients are sorted fairly. Now the trial begins. The next hurdle is performance bias. This asks, were the two groups treated differently by the doctors, nurses, or even themselves outside of the actual pill they were swallowing?
And the defense mechanism against performance bias is blinding, specifically the blinding of participants and personnel. Let's look at your migraclear trial. If the patients know they are receiving the expensive new wonder drug, their psychological placebo response goes through the roof. They expect to feel better, so they report feeling better.
And what if the doctor knows? If I'm a doctor and I know my patient is getting the real migraclear, I might be super enthusiastic during their checkups. I might give them extra advice on managing stress or suggest they drink more water. But for the patient on the placebo, I might just rush them out the door.
Exactly. That extra supplementary care and enthusiasm is a co-intervention. It alters the outcome independently of the drug itself. If the systematic reviewer sees that the trial was open label, meaning everyone knew who was getting what, the study is flagged for high risk of performance bias.
The third domain in the Cochrane scheme is attrition bias. This deals with people dropping out of the study. Let's say our migraclear drug works great for headaches, but it has a terrible side effect. It causes severe, relentless nausea.
In a trial of 100 people taking migraclear, let's say 40 of them can't handle the nausea and drop out of the study completely after the first week. The 60 people who remain happen to have stronger stomachs, and they report great pain relief.
But if the researchers only publish the data for the 60 people who finished the trial and completely ignore the 40 people who dropped out, the drug looks incredibly safe and effective. The failures vanished into thin air.
That is massive attrition bias. The systematic reviewer scrutinizes the flow of participants. They look for incomplete outcome data. If there is a high dropout rate, and the reasons for dropping out are related to the intervention, and the authors didn't use advanced statistical methods to account for the missing data, the study is deemed highly biased.
We are down to the final two domains. Next is detection bias. This asks if the outcomes were measured differently between the two groups. How does this happen?
This requires blinding of the outcome assessors. Let's say in our migraine trial, the outcome isn't just a self-reported pain scale, but an MRI scan looking for brain inflammation. The radiologist reading the scan has to interpret ambiguous gray shadows. If the radiologist knows the scan belongs to a patient on the revolutionary migraclear, they might subconsciously interpret those shadows more optimistically than if they knew the scan belonged to a placebo patient.
Human bias creeping in at the evaluation stage, so the assessor must be completely blind to the allocation. And finally, the fifth domain, reporting bias. We touched on this with the protocols.
Reporting bias, specifically selective outcome reporting, occurs when researchers measure multiple different outcomes, but only publish the ones that make their drug look good. In your trial, they might have measured headache frequency, duration, and intensity.
Let's say migraclear completely failed to reduce the frequency or duration of the migraines, but it slightly reduced the intensity for an hour.
If the authors only report the intensity data in the final published paper and quietly sweep the frequency and duration data under the rug, they are misleading the public. The systematic reviewer catches this by comparing the final published paper against the original protocol registered in Prospero. If the protocol promised to report frequency and the final paper doesn't, the alarm bells ring. High risk of reporting bias.
Garbage in equals garbage out. You cannot mathematically combine deeply flawed, unblinded, highly biased studies and expect the final aggregate result to be the pristine truth. The refinery is only as reliable as the risk of bias assessment allows it to be.
Which brings us perfectly to the core machinery of the refinery itself, the statistical forge. This is where we transition from a qualitative systematic review into a quantitative meta-analysis. Now, it is important to note that not all systematic reviews include a meta-analysis. If the studies are too different or the risk of bias is too extreme, a responsible reviewer will stop and just provide a narrative synthesis. But when the conditions are right, meta-analysis is incredibly powerful.
So why do we do it? Why go through the mathematical nightmare of combining data from 10 different trials?
Because of statistical power. Imagine a beautifully conducted randomized trial. Perfect blinding, flawless allocation concealment, zero dropouts. It is methodologically pristine. But because the disease is rare, the trial only managed to enroll 40 patients. 20 got the drug, 20 got the placebo.
The results might show a slight benefit for the drug, but because the sample size is so small, how do we know it wasn't just a fluke?
Exactly. Small trials have wide margins of error. They lack the statistical power to definitively prove a small or moderate treatment effect. But if our global dragnet found 10 similar, high-quality trials, each with 40 patients, we could use meta-analysis to mathematically pool them together. Suddenly, we aren't looking at 40 patients. We are analyzing an effective sample size of 400 patients.
We are combining their strength.
By pooling the data, we drastically minimize the mathematical effects of random chance. The margin of error shrinks significantly. We generate a highly precise, highly confident estimate of the true treatment effect.
And the way this pooled truth is presented to the world is through one of the most iconic, elegant visuals in all of science, the forest plot. If you open any Cochrane review, you will see these graphs everywhere. Since we are on an audio medium, I want to vividly paint a picture of a forest plot for you. Imagine a square graph. Right down the exact middle of the graph, from top to bottom, is a solid, dark, vertical line. This is the line of no effect. If a study's results land dead center on this line, it means the drug did absolutely nothing compared to the placebo, a complete tie.
Now, for every individual trial included in the meta-analysis, you will see a square plotted on this graph. If the square is plotted to the left side of the vertical line, it means that specific trial found the new treatment was better. If it is plotted on the right side, it means the placebo or control was better.
But the squares aren't all the same size. If a study had 5,000 patients in it, it gets a massive, heavy square because its large sample size means its data is highly precise and carries a lot of mathematical weight. If a study only had 20 patients, it gets a tiny little dot of a square because its data carries very little weight.
Sticking horizontally out of the left and right sides of each square is a thin line. These are the confidence intervals, representing the margin of error. That tiny 20-person study will have really wide, long horizontal lines, stretching far out in both directions, because we are very uncertain about its exact result. The massive 5,000-person study will have very short, tight lines, reflecting high certainty.
When you stack 20 of these squares and lines on top of each other, it looks a bit like a dense forest of trees. But the entire purpose of the forest plot sits at the very bottom of the graph. Underneath all the individual trees, after the statistical software has crunched all the numbers and weighted all the studies, it draws a single shape, a diamond.
That diamond is the synthesized truth. The center of the diamond represents the overall pooled estimate of effect across all the thousands of patients. The width of the diamond represents the final synthesized margin of error.
And here's the golden rule of reading a forest plot look at where the diamond sits. If the entire diamond sits clearly to the left of the vertical line of no effect, without its tips touching the line at all, you have synthesized statistically significant proof that the intervention works.
But before we declare victory and rewrite the medical textbooks based on that diamond, we have to look for the expert's warning, light heterogeneity.
Right. When you look at the forest plot, you have to ask, do all the individual squares generally agree with each other? Are they all clustered on the left side, pointing in the same direction? Or are they scattered wildly all over the map, with some far to the left and some far to the right?
If they are scattered wildly, we have high heterogeneity. The meta-analysis software runs specific statistical tests, like the I-squared statistic, to measure exactly how much of that wild scatter is due to true fundamental differences between the trials versus just random chance.
And if the I-squared test comes back screaming that heterogeneity is dangerously high?
Then the alarm bells ring. It means the studies are fundamentally disagreeing with each other in a way that random chance cannot explain. Perhaps the doses of the drugs were different or the populations were vastly different. If heterogeneity is too high, it is actually scientifically invalid to pool the data. You have committed the sin of mixing apples and oranges, and that beautiful diamond at the bottom of the graph is mathematically meaningless. You have to stop, break the data apart, and investigate why the studies disagree.
Okay, but let's assume the heterogeneity is low. The studies agree. The diamond is solid and sits clearly on the side of the new drug. It works. Here is a situation that happens all the time. A clinician looks at that massive pool of data and they ask, okay, the drug works on average for everyone, but I have a 65-year-old diabetic male patient sitting in my office. Does the drug work specifically for him? This leads to researchers chopping the pooled data back up into smaller pieces, right?
Yes, that is called a subgroup analysis. Let's look at the data just for men, or just for the elderly, or just for diabetics. And here I must issue a very stern critical warning. Subgroup analyses are incredibly dangerous statistical traps because of a phenomenon known as multiplicity.
How does multiplicity work? Why is it dangerous to ask specific questions of the data?
To understand multiplicity, we could use a classic analogy often referenced in statistical training regarding the rolling of dice. Imagine you have a pair of fair six-sided dice. What are the odds that you roll snake eyes, 2 ones on your very first throw?
It's pretty low, 1 in 36 chance.
Exactly, it's rare. But what if I give you the dice and tell you to roll them 50 times in a row? What are the odds that you will roll snake eyes at least once during those 50 throws?
No, it becomes almost guaranteed. If I roll enough times, I'm bound to hit it eventually, purely by chance.
That is exactly how statistical testing works in a dataset. In statistics, a significant result is usually defined as a finding that has less than a 5% probability of occurring by random chance. But every single time you slice the data to test a new subgroup, men over 60, women under 40, patients in rural clinics, patients with high cholesterol, you are rolling the statistical dice again.
So if I run 20 different subgroup analyses on my data, the math dictates that I'm almost guaranteed to find at least one subgroup where the drug looks like an absolute miracle, or a subgroup where the drug looks completely ineffective, purely due to random chance.
Precisely. You will find a false positive. You will publish a paper saying this drug is a miracle specifically for left-handed men over 50. Not because there is any biological truth to it, but simply because you rolled the dice enough times to hit an anomaly. This is why the rules around subgroup analysis are ruthlessly strict.
How do you protect against it? Do you just ban subgroup analysis entirely?
No, but the rule is a subgroup analysis should only be trusted if it was explicitly planned a priori. Meaning, the researchers must have hypothesized the biological reason for the subgroup difference and written it down in their publicly registered Prospero protocol before they ever looked at the data.
If they just start slicing the data after they've seen the results, searching for something interesting to publish?
That is called data dredging, and it is scientifically invalid. Unplanned post hoc subgroup analyses should only ever be viewed as hypothesis generating for future trials, never as definitive proof to guide clinical practice. As the textbook profoundly notes, for an individual patient sitting in a clinic, the overall aggregate result, the big diamond, is usually a much safer, more reliable bet than a highly spliced, dice-rolling subgroup result.
Before we leave the statistical forge, there is one more stress test the refinery runs. Sensitivity analyses, what are those?
A sensitivity analysis asks a simple question. How sensitive is our final diamond to the arbitrary decisions we made along the way? For example, during the risk of bias assessment, maybe we debated whether to include 3 trials that were somewhat poorly blinded. We decided to keep them in.
But a critic might say, your diamond is only positive because you included those 3 garbage trials.
So we run a sensitivity analysis. We temporarily remove those 3 high-risk trials from the statistical software, and we rerun the math. We watch the forest plot. Does the diamond suddenly shift drastically toward the line of no effect? If it does, our conclusion is weak and highly sensitive to bias.
But if you remove the bad trials, or if you rerun the math using a different statistical model, and that big diamond barely moves a millimeter,
then you can confidently tell the world that your synthesized conclusion is rock solid. It is robust. It withstands methodological stress testing.
Okay, the refinery has done its job. We have our robust diamond. The final stage of this entire endeavor is translation to practice. How do we take this massive, complex mathematical process and report it to the world so that a policymaker or a busy clinician can actually use it?
Transparency is the ultimate currency of science. Systematic reviewers don't just write an essay. They adhere to an incredibly rigorous, internationally recognized reporting framework called PRISMA. PRISMA. It stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses.
I have seen CRISMA flow diagrams in papers. They are fascinating to look at. They visually map the attrition of the evidence.
They force absolute, uncompromising accountability. The Prisma flow diagram starts at the top with a massive box. We found 15,000 records from our database search. The next box down, we remove 4,000 duplicate records.
Then it cascades down. We screened the titles and abstracts of the remaining 11,000 and excluded 10,500 because they clearly didn't match our PIC.
Leaving 500 full-text articles to read. The diagram then demands that you categorize exactly why you threw out the remaining papers. Excluded 200 due to wrong study design. Excluded 150 due to wrong patient population. Until finally, at the very bottom of the diagram, you reach the final, pristine number 25 studies included in the qualitative synthesis and meta-analysis. It shows the reader the exact, verifiable path the crude oil took through the refinery.
But even with a perfect Prisma diagram and a robust diamond, we have to talk about the limits of evidence synthesis. Because at the end of the day, a doctor still has to treat a human being, not a forest plot. How does a practitioner bring this high-level math back down to the reality of the clinic?
This is a crucial philosophical point. A systematic review is the pinnacle of evidence, but it is only one pillar of evidence-based medicine, or EBM. The systematic review provides the synthesized data, but EBM also requires the clinician's own professional expertise and assessment of local feasibility, and above all, the patient's own values and preferences.
Right. A massive meta-analysis might decisively prove that a specific spinal surgery is statistically superior to physical therapy for reducing back pain. But if the patient sitting in the office is terrified of surgery and deeply values avoiding invasive procedures, the meta-analysis does not overrule the patient's autonomy.
Furthermore, we have to wrestle with the concept of applicability. Let's say our systematic review pooled data exclusively from highly funded, ultra-modern academic research hospitals in urban centers like Boston, London, and Toronto. The intervention looks incredibly effective in the forest plot. But can a global health policymaker take that diamond and safely apply those findings to a rural, under-resourced district hospital in sub-Saharan Africa?
That is a massive leap of faith. The user of the review has to critically evaluate whether the P and the I, the participants, and the specific interventions in the review actually match their local population.
Precisely. If the highly effective intervention requires a continuous cold chain storage system, advanced MRI imaging, and highly trained specialists to administer, its mathematical efficacy in Boston might be totally inapplicable in a rural setting without reliable electricity. The diamond proves efficacy in the trial setting. It does not guarantee universal applicability in the real world.
And what about the quality of the reviews themselves? We spent all this time talking about how reviewers judge individual trials. Who reviews the reviewers? How do I know if a systematic review is actually a good systematic review and not just a traditional review in disguise?
The scientific community has developed tools exactly for this purpose. The textbook mentions AmStar, a measurement tool to assess systematic reviews, and the Overview Quality Assessment Questionnaire, or OQA. These are formal grading rubrics used to evaluate the methodological rigor of the review itself. They ask questions like, did the author search at least 2 electronic databases? Did 2 independent reviewers extract the data? Did they appropriately assess the risk of bias?
So you can effectively score a systematic review to see if it's trustworthy. There's one last bias I want to touch on, and it relates to the passage of time. A systematic review is not a permanent, unchanging truth written in stone, is it?
Not at all. A systematic review is merely a snapshot of the literature at the exact specific moment the database search was conducted.
Yeah.
If the search was run in January 2023, the review is blind to anything published in February 2023. This is why the Cochrane collaboration has a strict mandate that their reviews must be updated every 2 years. If a review in a fast-moving field is 5 years old, it might be entirely obsolete.
And the textbook warns about something called time lag bias. What is that?
Time lag bias is a phenomenon where the very first systematic reviews published on a brand new intervention often look incredibly overly positive. Why? Because, as we discussed with publication bias, the early, exciting, positive trials get written up and published very rapidly.
The negative, disappointing trials take much longer to grind through the peer review process, or the authors drag their feet writing them up.
Exactly. So the early refinery is only processing the optimistic, fast-moving crude oil. Over time, Usually a few years later, as the slower negative studies finally emerge into the literature and are incorporated into the updated systematic reviews, we often see the size of the diamond shrink. The true effect size is usually smaller than the early reviews suggested.
That is fascinating. It's a sobering reminder that science is a continuously self-correcting process. Which brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today. We have established that systematic reviews are undisputedly the absolute pinnacle of scientific evidence. They are the ultimate safeguard against human bias, error, and noise. But the architecture of this refinery is incredibly slow. Designing a protocol, running a global dragnet across 5 databases, extracting data in duplicate, running the meta-analysis, it takes a team of researchers months, sometimes years, to complete a single high-quality review.
It's a massive undertaking.
So here is the question for the future of public health. How do we handle novel, fast-moving, explosive global health crises? Think about the early days of a sudden pandemic. When waiting 2 years for a pristine Cochrane review costs hundreds of thousands of lives, how does the architecture of accumulated evidence adapt? Does the system need a fast-track, real-time, perhaps AI-assisted mechanism in the digital age? Can we build a refinery that operates at the speed of a modern global crisis without sacrificing the rigorous bias prevention filters that make the synthesis valuable in the first place? It is a massive engineering problem for the next generation of global public health leaders to solve.
That is a profound dilemma. And it is exactly what the pioneers of living systematic reviews are currently actively grappling with. But before we ask our listeners to go out and solve the future of public health methodology, we need to ensure the foundational concepts from today's deep dive are firmly anchored. Before we sign off, we know a lot of you listening are medical students, junior doctors, or public health trainees who use this show to consolidate your knowledge and prepare for exams. So we are going to wrap up with a structured mental check. Think of it as clinical rounds for your ears.
I love this, a rapid-fire recall segment. Let's run through it.
I have 6 rapid single best answer style questions. I will read the question and the options. We will pause briefly for you to lock in your answer, and then I will give the solution and the reference point in the text. Let's begin. Question 1. What is the primary methodological purpose of registering a systematic review protocol in a database like Prospero before commencing the search? A, to secure peer-reviewed funding for the extensive review process. B, to bypass the lengthy journal peer review process upon completion. C, to automate the literature search across multiple global databases. Or D, to reduce bias from post-hoc methodological changes and prevent global duplication of effort. Take a second to lock in your answer.
Got your answer.
The answer is D. The primary purpose is transparency. It locks in the methodology to prevent post-hoc data dredging and alerts the global community to prevent duplication. If you need to consolidate this, revisit the review protocol section of Chapter 5.15.
All right, question 2. In the PI-CO framework used for structuring clinical questions, what exactly does the C represent? A, cohort, B, comparator, C, confounding, or D, continuous? Give it a thought.
The answer is B, comparator. It clearly defines what the intervention is being measured against, whether that is a placebo or the current standard of care. Refer back to the section on formulating the review question.
Question 3. Which of the following is a fundamental characteristic that differentiates a rigorous, systematic review from a traditional literature review? A, it relies entirely on easily accessible English-language journals to ensure rapid publication. B, it is usually much broader in scope to capture a wider audience. C, it rarely assesses the methodological risk of bias in the included primary studies. Or D, it uses explicit predefined eligibility criteria to prevent selection bias on behalf of the reviewer. Take a moment.
The answer is D. The use of explicit, transparent eligibility criteria is the defining filter of the systematic review, preventing the author from cherry-picking their favorite flowers. Table 5.15.1 provides the complete breakdown of these differences.
Question 4 takes us into the interrogation of the studies themselves. In the Cochrane domain-based scheme for assessing risk of bias, evaluating the blinding of participants and personnel is primarily done to prevent which specific type of bias? A, attrition bias, B, selection bias, C, performance bias, or D, reporting bias. Think about that one.
The answer is C, performance bias. If participants or healthcare providers know who is receiving the active intervention, they may systematically alter their behavior, providing different care outside the study parameters. This is detailed in Table 5.15.2 under Assessing Risk of Bias.
Question 5. We talked extensively about the danger of rolling the statistical dice. What is the primary danger of conducting multiple unplanned subgroup analyses in a meta-analysis? A, it mathematically decreases the overall sample size of the primary trials. B, it artificially eliminates statistical heterogeneity across the forest plot. C, it increases the likelihood of finding statistically significant results purely by random chance due to multiplicity. Or D, it prevents the reviewers from successfully running sensitivity analyses. Lock it in.
The answer is C. The danger is multiplicity. Unplanned slicing of the data drastically inflates the chance of finding a false positive anomaly. You can review the warnings on this in the Summarizing the Evidence section.
And our final question, question 6. When interpreting the final diamond of a systematic review, what concept specifically asks whether the synthesized results derived from affluent academic hospitals can be safely and effectively utilized in an under-resourced rural clinic? A, applicability. B, allocation concealment. C, time lag bias. Or D, sequence generation. Take your final guess.
The answer is A, applicability. A systematic review may provide a mathematically precise estimate of effect, but the end user must always evaluate if their specific clinical context matches the populations studied. This is central to evidence-based medicine, found in the Interpreting the Findings section.
If you nailed those, your conceptual framework of the refinery is rock solid. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of how we build certainty out of chaos. Here are the details of this episode.
Wait, let's keep the format.
Good point. Here are the details of this episode.
GPH 41, Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. Byline.
From single studies to synthesized certainty, how public health separates noise from signal through structured evidence aggregation.